Welcome to this presentation on poetry and cognition, how the poetic line wraps and unwraps meaning. I'm Elizabeth Robar from Scriptura. If you ask a group of people to define poetry, one of the most common responses, half in jest, is, "It's not prose." That response, while simplistic, contains a surprising degree of insight. Poetry distinguishes itself not primarily by its topic or the presence of rhyme or meter, but by the way it uses language. The essence of poetry lies in how it disrupts our habitual patterns of comprehension. Prose, especially in modern literate societies, is treated as the natural or default mode of communication. We think of prose as prototypically intended to convey information. Its success depends on clarity, directness, and efficiency. It aims to make language as transparent as possible so that attention is focused on content, not form. Please note my use of prototypical. In the end, there's of course a spectrum, but it is very useful to have a clear understanding of what we mean when we say poetry is not prose. By contrast, poetry eschews efficiency. If poetry appears simple and clear, it is usually so on the surface, but underneath there's a world of meaning. Think of many proverbs, such as the Full Day proverb, "Every new knife shaves well." The purpose is to elicit a deeper, richer understanding. Were one to see only the surface meaning, it would indeed be nothing but prose. To borrow a term from Russian formalism, poetry defamiliarizes language. It takes what is ordinary and presents it in a way that is strange and unfamiliar, and therefore that slows perception and invites deeper reflection. From a cognitive linguistic perspective, this act of defamiliarization has profound implications. The human mind constantly seeks efficiency. It relies on schemas, habits, and shortcuts to process language quickly. Poetry frustrates those shortcuts. It forces readers to rebuild meaning through slower, more deliberate mental operations. In this sense, poetry is not merely a stylistic alternative to prose. It is a different mode of cognition, one that arrives at comprehension only by means of a kind of poetic experience, or what has been called aesthetic cognition. One of the most basic ways poetry achieves this defamiliarization is through lineation. The poetic line is not simply a matter of formatting. It is a distinct unit of cognition, cutting across the natural boundaries of grammar and syntax. A sentence might run over several lines, or a single line might contain multiple sentences. In either case, the line imposes a rhythm and structure independent of ordinary linguistic units. Empirically, the poetic line tends to coincide with the breath unit, a span of roughly 3 seconds, or around 10 syllables, corresponding to the length of a comfortable spoken phrase. This rhythm is not arbitrary. Studies of working memory show that about 3 seconds marks the typical duration of the now that human attention can comfortably hold before needing closure. In poetry, then, the line acts as a temporal package, a short burst of sound and sense that the brain can perceive, hold, and process as a whole before moving to the next. Each line functions as a conceptual gestalt. It invites the listener to form a complete mental picture, even though that picture will later be revised by the lines that follow. This contrasts sharply with prose. In prose, rhythm is largely a byproduct of syntax and natural intonation. A sentence ends when grammar and meaning demand it. But in poetry, line breaks often occur in ways that interrupt those expectations. The line dictates rhythm. It does not merely record it. Each break, each pause, forces the reader to reconsider what has just been said and to anticipate what might come next. This means that the line itself, its boundaries and its rhythm, becomes a locus of meaning, not in terms of content, but in terms of the process of meaning construction or developing one's own mental representation. A reader cannot move through poetry at the same speed as prose. The line requires a moment of closure, a tiny mental reset before the next begins. In this way, poetry constructs meaning through repeated acts of segmentation, little packets of perception that together create an aesthetic rhythm. The relevance of this to biblical poetry can be established from our earliest manuscripts. The layout of Psalms and other poetic books in both Hebrew and Greek sources is consistently with distinct poetic lines, not the running text of continuous prose. In Greek terms, sticographic. While the Hebrew would have 2 sticks or poetic phrases per line, and the Greek 1, Ryan Sykes has recently argued that this is the Greek scribal convention most likely adapting the Hebrew to match native Greek verse structures. Thereby, it preserves the poetic phrases from an earlier Hebrew tradition, albeit now 1 per line. This consistency across languages and centuries suggests that poetic lineation was integral to how the Psalms were understood and performed. The ancient scribes who copied them were not inventing new divisions. They were preserving ones already known through performance. How can we be so sure? The same principle can be observed in the Masoretic accentual system, developed to preserve the oral reading tradition. The Masoretes did not create poetry, they recorded how it had been performed. Both stacography and accentuation are best understood as acts of cognitive preservation, or one might say prosodic preservation, written symbols designed to capture prosodic features that were vital to how meaning was processed aloud. If Hebrew poetry had been primarily syntactic, like prose, such systems would be unnecessary. The very existence of poetic lineation implies that the poetic line was an independent cognitive and rhythmic unit, a way of packaging thought and emotion for oral performance. Thus, in Hebrew, as in other traditions, the poetic line superseded natural intonation. It offered a higher order structure that controlled not just sound, but also meaning reconstruction. From here on, I will use the term poetic line to refer to this distinctively poetic prosodic unit, the minimal unit of poetic composition, prototypically represented as 1 stick and traditionally rendered with 1 typographic line in Greek and English. I trust the ancient Hebrew writers will not begrudge my not reflecting their practice of 2 sticks per typographic line. Please note that I do not claim that all poetic lines are equal. In fact, their very variation provides much of the texture in poetry. At this point, a practical question arises. Why preserve such a cumbersome and space-consuming layout? Why would scribes leave costly parchment blank merely to maintain short poetic lines? Why did the Masoretes invest so much care in recording minute details of poetic intonation? The answer lies in what poetry is trying to do. Poetic form is not a decorative overlay on meaning. It is part of the meaning itself. When prose is sufficient, when clarity, precision, and transparency are the goals, poetry adds little. But when the goal is to evoke emotion, to express reverence, or to grapple with deep truths, ordinary language often becomes inadequate. In my own field of Bible translation, this distinction is crucial. Translation theory has, in recent decades, defined quality by 3 criteria: clear, accurate, and natural. Clear has practically come to mean transparent, nothing hidden, nothing left to infer. Yet, biblical poetry is intentionally non-transparent. It invites ambiguity, resonance, and meditation. Rendering such poetry in plain prose risks losing not only its beauty, but its very logic. Cultural preferences explain this view of quality. As Rochelle Wenger observes, the Western ideal of plain speech is the source of clear, accurate, and natural, but it's not universal. In many African cultures, directness is for language for children. Wisdom is expressed through figurative speech, proverb, and rhythm, through poetic language. A simple declarative sentence is appropriate for children, but serious thought requires imagery. In this context, the defamiliarization achieved by poetic form is not a barrier to meaning, but a marker that reflects the nature of the meaning and how one is to apprehend it. It signals that the message requires careful thought in order to be fully appreciated. As with the proverb above, the new knife that shaves well, it means something very different when understood as prose versus poetry. Note that in this case, the poetic rendition is not determined by the actual wording. Being so short, it's identical to the prose. But rather, it would be identified by the social context, which requires it to be handled cognitively as poetic, not prosaic. Margaret Freeman's concept of the poem as icon provides a theoretical bridge here. Freeman argues that a poem should be treated not merely as a vehicle for propositions, but as an aesthetic object, something perceived, felt, and experienced. Just as an icon invites contemplation rather than analysis, a poem invites a mode of attention. Its meaning is not located solely in what it states, but in how it works upon the senses and mind. From this perspective, the poetic line is one of the most important features of the poem as icon. Each line is a perceptual frame, a moment of engagement. Reading or hearing a poem means entering into a cycle of expectation and fulfillment. Wrapping and unwrapping may be a helpful metaphor. It's a cycle through which aesthetic cognition unfolds. Our task, therefore, is to describe this cycle in cognitive linguistic terms. 1. How a poet begins with a mental representation and wraps it in poetic form. And 2. How a listener or reader unwraps that form into a new mental representation. The overlap between these two mental representations is what we mean by successful poetic communication. We begin with the poet. The poet does not start with lines or words, but with a holistic mental model, a conceptual network linking images, emotions, and intentions. The movement from this pre-verbal insight to an actual poem requires several distinct cognitive operations. First is conceptual packaging. The poet must decide how to divide the larger insight into manageable gestalts, self-contained packets of meaning that can each fit within a poetic line. This involves organizing experience into bounded units, much like scenes in a film. Each line is crafted to hold a single emotional or conceptual pulse. Simultaneously, we have construal, the choice of perspective or framing. The poet decides not only what to describe, but how to present it, through metaphor, contrast, or parallel scenes. Construal determines the relationship between the poet's mental model and the reader's potential reconstruction. Then we have conceptual compression. Complex relations are collapsed into compact expressions. Instead of narrating an entire sequence of actions, the poet may select a few emblematic moments that stand for the whole. This compression is what gives poetry its density. Unpacking a passage is the reciprocal process necessitated by such compression. Psalm 1:1 provides a good example. The verse reads, "Happy the one who's not walked according to a wicked counsel, has not stood in the path of sinners, and has not sat in the seat of mockers." We may infer that the poet's underlying mental model was a warning against the seductive process of moral compromise. The audience, inclined to toy with evil, needed to see where that path leads. A warning against starting on the path was insufficient. The poet also wanted to depict the end destination of the path. The verse is masterful in its simultaneous admiration for the one who never begins, and yet expose of those who do follow the path to its end. The poetic mastery begins through construal, in which the poet chooses to tell this story indirectly, not as instruction, but first as public praise for the person who refuses temptation. Were it simply that, however, the first line would be sufficient. "Happy the one who does not walk according to wicked counsel." Within this praise, though, is another embedded construal, that of depiction of the path of the one who does embrace wicked counsel. The verse unfolds as three stages of progressive entanglement: walking, standing, sitting. Each line encapsulates a phase of moral alignment: curiosity, association, and identification. Through compression, these stages are condensed into representative scenes. The reader receives the sense of a narrative without explicit storytelling, like storyboarding. The iconic mapping of physical action slows from movement to stillness, and it creates an invitation to experience, if you will, the decline of moral vitality. Thus, the poet's wrapping involves three intertwined operations: packaging a moral concept into a frame of public praise for one who chooses well, construal of perspective to visualize moral decline rather than describe it in moral terms, and compression of narrative into rhythmic symmetry. Each line, in the end, serves as a metonymic wrapper, a small cue pointing to a larger conceptual network. When the reader or listener encounters the poem, the process reverses. Each metonymic wrapper now requires unwrapping, the act of reconstructing the hidden network encoded by the poet. In cognitive terms, this involves conceptual integration or conceptual blending, combining mental spaces derived from different domains, such as the literal, walking, standing, sitting, and the moral, temptation, sin, identity, to form a new emergent structure. The reader first notices the surface pattern: three parallel lines with similar rhythm and syntax. This regularity invites the search for a shared conceptual ground. Through blending, physical movement becomes a metaphor for moral progression. Next comes gap filling. The text does not explain why the verbs are arranged as they are, but the human mind naturally seeks pattern and causality. The reader assumes that the sequence is purposeful and reconstructs a story of slowing down from walking or going to standing to sitting. Against the backdrop of moral decisions, this becomes a slowing down of moral vitality. This filling in process transforms a static description into a dynamic moral lesson. Finally, the reader experiences what Margaret Freeman calls aesthetic cognition, a moment of realization that unites form and meaning. The triadic rhythm itself communicates insight. The slowing movement feels like moral stagnation. The reader does not simply understand the message, but experiences it in some way. At the end of this process, the reader or listener arrives at an integrated mental model that mirrors, though never perfectly duplicates, the poet's own. The happy person is the one who avoids this entire downward trajectory. The poetic wrapping has guided the reader through an act of reconstruction that is itself, in however small a way, transformative. The interaction between poet, poem, and reader or hearer can now be summarized as a cycle of cognitive operations. First, there's the phase of creation done by the poet, in which we have packaging, construal, and compression, where the poet wraps a unified insight into rhythmic perceptual lines that both reveal and conceal meaning. In the transmission phase, we have the poetic form, that which we now have preserved, with its lineation, parallelism, and rhythm, where the text functions as an iconic medium, a perceptual object that invites engagement. Then finally, in the reception, you have the reader or the hearer, where we engage in integration, gap filling, and as the capstone, aesthetic realization, where the reader or hearer unwraps the poetic lines, reconstructing the hidden network through imagination and feeling. Through this slow rhythm of wrapping and unwrapping, poetry becomes a dialogue of cognition, aesthetic cognition. The poet compresses experience into form. The reader expands form back into experience. The poetic line sits at the heart of this exchange. It is both a unit of rhythm and a cognitive boundary marker. It shapes how thought is packaged, transmitted, and re-experienced. Far from being decorative, lineation is the mechanism by which poetry thinks, a rhythmic embodiment of the mind's own movement as it slowly reintegrates each line into a developing mental representation of a poem. Meaning construction happens, line by line. Thank you.